Where does Australia end? Australia is famously an island continent, so this seems like an easy question, but it's actually a bit complex. The problem isn't the Australian mainland, which definitely ends at its coastline, but rather which of Australia's neighbouring islands are actually part of the continent. The boundary between Australia and Asia in particular is the trickiest one, and it could plausibly be drawn in any of several different straits, potentially even extending halfway into Indonesia. Let's explore. You probably already know where Australia is. It's the place in the Southern Hemisphere with the Sydney Opera House, Uluru, and kangaroos and stuff. All those things can be found on mainland Australia, the Earth's fourth largest landmass after Afro-Eurasia, the Americas, and Antarctica. Knowing this, perhaps the most obvious place to start looking for the boundary between Australia and Asia is at the northern tip of mainland Australia, Cape York. Here we find the Torres Strait, separating mainland Australia from the island of New Guinea, the world's second largest island after Greenland. The Torres Strait is 94 miles or 151 kilometers across, and only about 15 meters or 50 feet deep. The islands in the Torres Strait, conveniently called the Torres Strait Islands, are part of the Australian state of Queensland, and are the traditional home of the Torres Strait Islanders. Culturally, the Torres Strait Islanders are distinct from the Aboriginal people of most of Australia. Instead, they share traditions and genetics more closely with the many Papuan peoples of New Guinea, and with the Austronesian peoples of basically half the planet. They also haven't been in Australia quite as long as the mainland Aboriginal peoples, reaching their home islands around 2,500 years ago, compared to the Aboriginal Australians at 65,000 or so years ago. That's not to say the Torres Strait Islanders weren't in contact with the Aboriginal people of Queensland. Indeed, the former lingua franca of the islands, Kalo-Laga-ya, is at its root an Australian language. The Torres Strait is certainly very important, but there's a pretty big problem with it being considered the edge of the Australian continent. It's really quite shallow and narrow. In fact, it's both shallower and narrower than the Bass Strait, which separates mainland Australia from Tasmania to the south. Tasmania is a full-on state of Australia the country, or more formally, the Commonwealth of Australia. Plus, it has cultural and historic links to the rest of Australia, so it's basically always counted as part of the continent, and rightly so. Since geologically, New Guinea is even more connected to Australia than Tasmania is, it makes a lot of sense to count it as part of the Australian continent as well. One reasonable limit to the continent of Australia that includes all three of these landmasses would be the edge of Australia's continental shelf, the area of shallow seafloor associated with the continent. This definition also includes the Aru Islands of Indonesia, and places the border between Australia and not Australia along a line through the Halmahera Sea, the Seram Sea, the Banda Sea, and the Timor Sea. The Banda Sea also happens to hold the Weber Deep, the deepest part of the ocean floor outside of an oceanic trench. Australia's continental shelf is sometimes called the Sahul Shelf, especially when referring to the northern part of the shelf in the Malay Archipelago. The Sahul Shelf, and continental shelves more generally, are very useful to study geologically. Continental crust and oceanic crust are formed from chemically different rocks, and the rocks in continental crust tend to stick around on Earth's surface for much longer. Indeed, the Eastern Pilbara Craton in Western Australia has some of the oldest surface rocks on Earth, at about 3.8 billion years old. The entire Sahul Shelf was also connected by land bridges when the sea levels were lower tens of thousands of years ago during the last glacial maximum. So, the Sahul Shelf is a good definition for Australia if you're, say, hunting for minerals or investigating the dispersal of species. The study of where species are located, or biogeography, actually points toward an even broader definition of Australia. Australia's wildlife has had the chance to evolve in relative isolation for tens of millions of years since Australia separated from Antarctica. Australia's characteristic animals, like marsupials, are found throughout the Sahul Shelf, including New Guinea with its tree kangaroos, which actually do exist despite looking and sounding like fake animals. But marsupials also extend even farther out. Marsupials like the cuscus are native to several Indonesian islands farther west than the edge of the Sahul Shelf. The cuscus is also present on the island of Timor, including the country of Timor-Leste, but zoologists think it was probably brought there by humans before the area's written history. Australian animals more generally, and some of its plants like eucalyptus trees, reach as far as the Wallace Line, named for Alfred Russel Wallace, who described it in his 1869 book about the region. Wallace took a ferry from the island of Bali to the island of Lombok, across the 15-mile-wide Lombok Strait, the narrowest part of the Wallace Line. Even across that short gap, Wallace recorded that Asian animals like woodpeckers suddenly gave way to Australian animals like cockatoos. The Lombok Strait is in fact much deeper than similarly wide straits between other Indonesian islands, 250 meters or 820 feet deep. This is because it lies at the edge of Southeast Asia's continental shelf, the Sunda Shelf. This means that land species couldn't cross the strait even when sea levels were lower. It also makes the Lombok Strait navigable by large ships, and in fact, the government of Indonesia has been promoting the Lombok Strait as an alternative to the congested Strait of Malacca to the northwest. The Lombok Strait is where the Wallace Line is the sharpest, but it was a bit more effort to define further north. The hardest island along the border to place is also the largest, Sulawesi. Sulawesi is home to both decidedly Asian species like the anoa, an Asian buffalo, and decidedly Australian species like the aforementioned cuscus. This puzzle was solved by tracing the island's geologic history. It turns out that Sulawesi wasn't originally a single island. It's an amalgamation of a piece of Australia and a piece of Asia that collided and merged. So you could argue that the continents of Australia and Asia share a land border in the mountains that run down the middle of Sulawesi itself. The islands between the Sunda and Sahul continental shelves, including Lombok and Sulawesi, have a mix of Australian and Asian wildlife. Biogeographers often consider them a transitional region between Asia and Australia, called Wallacea. The region of Wallacea isn't just important biologically. The Wallace Line also roughly follows the westernmost branch of the Indonesian throughflow, the ocean currents that carry water from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. Water comes in from the Pacific primarily through the Strait of Makassar between Sulawesi and Borneo, and flows out into the Indian Ocean through the Lombok Strait, the Timor Sea, and the Ombai Strait between Timor and Alor. So depending on what you need the definition for, the border between Australia and Asia lies somewhere from the Torres Strait through the Lombok Strait. But where does Australia end in all the other directions? Here again, this question of where is Australia really depends on why is Australia. From a continental shelf perspective, even some islands that are part of Australian states are not part of the Australian continent. The Lord Howe Island group in New South Wales is geologically part of the mostly submerged continent of Zealandia, along with islands like New Zealand and New Caledonia. Macquarie Island in the state of Tasmania is part of an oceanic ridge to Zealandia's south, and is made of rock from the Earth's mantle. From a political perspective, continents are used for grouping countries together for, say, making UN committees or international sports competitions. It would be rather annoying for Australia to be a continent with only one or two countries, and there are plenty of countries out in the Pacific that aren't geologically part of any continent. For these purposes, Australia is often classified as the largest country in the continent of Oceania, sharing a continent with New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and other island nations and territories across the Pacific. When defined as a cultural unit, Oceania is often defined to reach the far corners of the Polynesian Triangle, Hawaii, and Easter Island or Rapa Nui. From a biogeography perspective, many species in New Zealand are related to those of Australia, in particular those whose ancestors could hypothetically cross the Tasman Sea, like birds and bats. New Caledonia, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu are in a similar situation, leading these areas to be grouped with Australia and Wallacea as the Australasian biogeographic realm. Marsupials in particular are also found in the Americas, including the Virginia opossum, the northernmost wild marsupial. Biologists currently think that marsupials originated in South America and reached Australia through Antarctica, which has marsupial fossils. One South American marsupial, the Monito del Monte, is more closely related to Australia's marsupials than it is to the other marsupials of the Americas. So whether you're studying rocks, species, cultures, or politics, there's quite a lot more land down under than you might have realized. And while there are certainly reasons to use a smaller definition of Australia, there are also a lot of good reasons to add these additional austral archipelagos to the continent. And I for one think they should definitely qualify. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments and subscribe if you want to see more like this. And as always, thanks for watching.